Okay, so there are 4 sections to the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. I have assigned the preface, part 1, and a little bit of part 2, so most of what I'm going to talk about is going to focus on the preface in part 1. Before we get started with that, I just have a couple of things to say about the tradition that Rousseau is writing in, and it's a tradition that we refer to as social contract theory. Rousseau is one of 3 people who write in sort of the modern social contract theory tradition. And in social contract theory, what we're looking at is we're speculating. We are imagining what kinds of conditions civil societies and governments must have come about. So there's an assumption operating here that there haven't always been governments, right? For all of human history, there was a time when people were, not under the control of a ruling body. So if we think about this time and if we imagine what it must have been like, and figured out why we would have agreed to come together and live in civil society together, we can learn things about what humans naturally are like. So the 3 guys who deal with this stuff are Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Rousseau. And what they do is they posit what they call the state of nature. And that's just that pre-societal state, right? Where we existed without government. So they ask what conditions would have made humans agree to relinquish their absolute freedom and agree to subject themselves to the rule of a monarch or some kind of governing body. A couple of different views on the state of nature before we look at Rousseau's view in a few minutes. Hobbes thinks that this pre-societal life would have been really terrible. Basically, he thinks we would have been running around killing each other, that man is only self-interested and only concerned with his own preservation. So at the core, what humans are is self-interested, Hobbes thinks. Like, that's how we naturally would have existed. Locke has a different view. Locke really believes that pre-civilized man was guided by moral law that was given to him by God. So he's not only self-interested, he cares about other people. And he's not fighting against others and just looking out for himself, but he's actually more of a communal member of pre-society there. So those are the 2 views that Rousseau is kind of writing in response to. Again, it's just useful to kind of see that context. Locke's view is a little more, it's way more complicated than I've sort of constructed it for you, but basically it goes back to reason, right? Because man is gifted with the capacity to reason. Reason tells us that, hey, we have a creator who put us here, and he must have put us here for a reason. So he doesn't want us to kill each other. Therefore, we have to act in ways that are consistent with preserving humanity. So if you wanted to sort of trace the logic behind Locke's thought, that's where it comes from. So I'll get back to that stuff in a minute, but when we look at the preface of the Discourse, the fundamental question that Rousseau is trying to answer is how we know ourselves, right? What is our human nature at its core? The idea is that we have to sort of strip away all of the stuff that living in civil society has kind of tacked on to our human nature to see what we really were like originally. The big question Rousseau is trying to answer is, where does equality come from? But Rousseau was like, look, I can't even begin to talk about equality. Where does inequality come from? I can't even begin to talk about inequality until I figure out what humans are naturally like. So what he does is he has to try to find out what man was like in the state of nature. So he's doing that same social contract experiment. Now, on Rousseau's view, he finds that man operated in the state of nature on 2 principles. 1, self-preservation. He was concerned with ensuring that he stayed alive. And 2, pity. I like to refer to that as empathy, but I'll talk about that more in a minute. Before he talks about this, on page 14, he says, meditating on the first and most simple operations of the human souls, I believe I perceive in it 2 principles that are prior to reason. Now, this is a big thing for Rousseau because he doesn't think that we have this natural capacity for reason like Descartes does or Locke does. He thinks that reason is something that we developed along the way. So the natural status of man, like his natural capacity, is that he's interested in his self-preservation, but that he's also interested in preventing harm to others. He doesn't like seeing other people suffer. Another thing to understand when we are dealing with this social contract experiment and trying to figure out what man in the state of nature is like, is Rousseau's paradox. So Rousseau basically says, look, we've come so far. We've gotten so far beyond what natural man must have been like that it's almost impossible for us to try to imagine what his life was like, because we're so far removed from him. So Rousseau says the more civilization progresses, the further away that the human species moves from its primitive state. The more knowledge we gain, you'd think that the more knowledge we gain, the more likely we would be able to know about what things must have been like back then. But that's not true, and that's what makes it a paradox. So he says, it is by dint of studying man that we have rendered ourselves incapable of knowing him. So, because we can't use reason to understand man in the state of nature, because man in the state of nature didn't function with reason. Another thing that's going on in the preface that's really important is Rousseau's comparison of man to the Statue of Glaucus. He gets this from Plato, actually, from Book 10 of Plato's Republic. This statue, it's kind of dubious about whether it actually existed, but Plato tells the story about a statue of a sea god called Glaucus. And Glaucus was constructed at the ocean front, but after a while, he was exposed to the elements, the sea and the wind, and that eroded the statue, and eventually he stopped looking like a god and started looking more like a beast. Rousseau picks up on this metaphor, and he says, this is what's happened to humans. Glaucus is like humans, as we've been transformed nearly beyond recognition. The only difference here is that the statue of Glaucus is transformed by the natural elements. Humans have been transformed by society. We've been rendered just unrecognizable from what we once were. And Rousseau says, if we want to figure out what we were once like, it's like uncovering the original statue of Glaucus after it's been eroded. It's not going to be easy for us. So that's the preface. In part one of the discourse, the focus is really on the contrast between what Rousseau calls natural man or primitive man sometimes. I don't like the term primitive. I think it's really loaded and it's politically incorrect. So I like to use natural and modern man, but he's talking about man in the state of nature versus man in civil society. So he initially gives us a pretty similar picture to the pictures that Hobbes and Locke give us. Rousseau thinks we're pretty solitary in the state of nature. He just doesn't think that we come across humans that often, but that we're pretty much peaceful. So the problem is, so he looks back to the state of nature and then he looks to the present. He's like, look, we're not equal. But presumably we were equal in the past. So modern man is unequal and natural man was presumably way more equal than we were now. So how did this inequality actually happen? One thing to understand here is that Rousseau is dealing with two kinds of inequality. He's dealing with natural inequality, which is just physical inequality, right? Some people are taller than other people, and some people are faster, and some people are, more muscular and stuff like that. Rousseau's like, I don't care about that. That doesn't matter. I mean, it's the nature of human beings that we, develop unequally, sort of physically, right? What Rousseau's really interested in is what he calls political inequality, or you might see him refer to it as moral inequality. And that's, the kind of inequality where one person rules another person, right? Where one person is a slave and the other person is a king. Where one person is a ruler and the other person is a subject. So Rousseau is really interested in this structured inequality, right? The inequality that's not natural to man, but that is something that we have sort of developed over time. Alright, so I'll stop there for this one, and then I will continue on in the next one.